We were immigrants, and we had to make a living. You took any job you could get.
I thought it was just a family story.
He was there 25 years old, just 25 years old.
Then we found the diary, the photos, everything.
He said to try to persuade Kilo that it was in his own interest to have Tess made.
I actually do recall my brother saying he was not looking forward to going back down in that hole.
She said, why don't you just call it sick? It's too dangerous, don't go.
If something happens, you have John. Those are the last words that I remember my dad saying.
He was down below somewhere when the whole thing collapsed.
He was halfway down the hole, and he had reinforcement bar through his chest.
Our family was the only ones that could have an open coffin.
The guy told her to get a chair and sit down.
He kept saying, it was all my fault, it was all my fault. That was the last time that I saw him.
All right, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us for Remembering Them, an anniversary event for the Dresden tragedy of 1957. Thank you also to Al Komanek and the Old Czech Hall for hosting this event. My name is Eric Philpott. I'm the writer and director of the documentary that's currently in production. One of your town councillors, Rhonda Jubinville, reached out to us while we were doing our crowdfunding campaign recently, and I'd like to invite Rhonda to come up and introduce the evening and the topic that we're going to be looking at today. Rhonda?
Thank you. Thank you, Eric. I would like to start by bringing greetings from the municipality of Chatham-Kent and Dresden, and welcome all of you to our beautiful community. Today is the date and even the weekday, Wednesday, when what was then Ontario's worst multi-fatality workplace disaster, which occurred on August 14th, 1957. That disaster was a cave-in that happened on Sydenham Street here in Dresden. The work team had excavated a deep pit beside the Sydenham River. They were nearly finished pouring the concrete foundations for a new pumping station when one side of the pit collapsed, burying 5 workers and pulling their foreman in with them. The building we are in right now, the Old Czech Hall, is a part of that story. This is where the coroner's inquest was held 4 weeks after the cave-in. So this is a very sad anniversary, but there's something else that I think is important, and that's who's here today. Residents of Dresden, including some who remember the tragedy and what happened in the town that night. We have people here who had never heard of this before and who want to know more, including myself. We have a small film crew here who are working on a film to finally tell this important story. That film crew includes Eric Philpott, whose late father was the site engineer on that project. And especially, we have family members of each of the 6 men who lost their lives that night. At 7 p.m., the time of the cave-in, we will mark the occasion with a moment of silence to honor the memories of those who died together with their families. Thank you.
I want to say that this story is really, it's about these families, the men who died and these families. And in the film, it's their voices that tell this story. This is their story. But tonight we're doing something different. We're doing it for them, so that we are gathered around them and recognizing that this happened. And they, for once, don't have to make an effort for it. They can receive the story from us. Yesterday, I was with my little crew, and we visited the cemetery in Almer where these men are buried, or 5 of the 6 men are buried. This photo is actually from last year because that's Wayne Hochstein there, who's been incredibly helpful to us in the process of researching and preparing and making this film. And there you can see the memorial marker, which has the names of 5 of the men. The 6th man, Dirk Reichson, lived in Byron, and his wife wanted him to be buried in London, so he would be close to her. That's why there's only 5 names here. But if you stand in front of that monument, you can see 5, actually 6 spots there, 5 of the men lying side by side today. And it's a little bit, it's beautiful if you look, because behind that you'll see some of the widows of those men who have passed away and are buried there. And then behind that you can see in-laws and even some children and so on, almost like a family tree spread down in this cemetery. It's a beautiful sight, and you should see it if you get a chance. As we were leaving yesterday, something I hadn't noticed, there's a chance Wayne told me about this and I didn't notice it before, but right across is a tobacco field. And that's really poetic, actually, because working in tobacco is how many of these families, and when I say these families, I mean people in this room, they helped their families make ends meet working in tobacco. And so there it is, right beside the cemetery, a tobacco field. Now, if I think about this, the thing that really strikes me about this story, the thing that is almost kind of hard to believe, is just incredibly how quickly this story disappeared. This story was well known when it happened. It was in the press everywhere. But the shocking thing is how quickly it disappeared. And I want to give a comparison. Less than 3 years after this, there was another workplace tragedy in Toronto at Hoggs Hollow. There was an underground fire where they were building in a large sewer main deep underground. There was a fire. 5 workers were killed, also immigrant workers, by the way. And there was a similar reaction at first. There was a police investigation, that's the word. There was an inquest, but there was a lot more. And within 1 month, a royal commission was working. That commission worked from early April until end of October, almost the whole year. They heard deputations from all around the province, a comprehensive review of workplace safety all around Ontario. They had over 120 witnesses, over 160 documents were submitted. This was thorough, and all of our modern workplace legislation is based on that. So Ontario's workplace safety laws today all come from this investigation, the Royal Commission after Hoggs Hollow. Now, you would think that Ontario's worst workplace accident would come up in an investigation like this. And if it has, I have not found it. This here is one document out of the 160 plus, actually. That document, which you can't read there, it's from the Department of Labor. And that document refers to the history of the Trench Excavators Protection Act. And here are the passages in it where it says that on 3 occasions, a contractor was charged with breach of not following the Trench Excavators Protection Act. 2 of them resulted in convictions, and in 1 case, the contractor was acquitted because the definition of trench wasn't clear, so said the judge in that case. That is the only reference to Ontario's biggest workplace disaster in the entire Hoggs Hollow Royal Commission, which honestly boggles the mind. When we say the story is forgotten, we're not talking about forgotten over years and years and years. It was forgotten then. And remember, this is a story that was in the newspapers across Canada, also in Holland. This was not a secret when it happened. So how did that disappear? Even there, you can't read it, I apologize, but in there you can see the name John Ort. That's the Department of Labor investigator here when the Dresden disaster happened. He was here the night it happened. He was here through the recovery, and he's the one who told the town of Dresden they had to press charges to uphold the Trench Excavators Protection Act, etc. In other words, John Ort is fully aware of what happened in Dresden, and as far as I know, he didn't mention it. Imagine if that report, if that Royal Commission had even just had this photo, this is one of my father's photos. Behind these men, the wall goes up 35 feet, and you can see men in a pit with absolutely zero protection. There's no reinforcements supporting the sides. This is the pit they would die in the next day. So you could see that. It's astonishing to me. So there's a mystery here. Now, I will say one thing before we get too conspiratorial about it. I am deep in the weeds on this, and I can tell you there's not one reason. It's complicated, and I think that's one of the reasons why a film about this is important, to explore that and how that story could disappear. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the magical process of kind of retrieving or reconstructing this story, because it really is something magical. And I have to say, as a filmmaker, nothing motivates me more than wanting to save a story that was very nearly gone. So for me, this magic started, of course, in our own family when my mother discovered my father's diary. And the diary gives a day-by-day description of the project in Dresden. Before this, I'd heard the story from my mother, not from my father. My father died 30 years ago, so it's too late. I wish I'd asked back then, but I didn't. I didn't know to ask. She told me, but I couldn't find anything when I was searching for information about it. And then we find this diary and the photo album and letters and everything is documented like on a day-by-day basis. It's 2 diaries, actually, for the whole project, which took 10 months. So here you see a page of that, and that's where the process began. But this has been really almost magical, the way things pop up. And here's one example. About a month ago, maybe 6 weeks ago, I don't know, I was rewriting the script, which is kind of the outline of how you're going to tell the story in the film. And I came to the part about the plan for building a water treatment plant in Dresden. And not for the first time I thought, I still don't have a plan. Like, where is that plan? Maybe I'm going to find a plan of a building like it so I can at least show what that kind of building would be. That day, I got an email from Doug Goudreau, a Dresden resident who's been, like Wayne Hochstein, one of the sort of quiet but very industrious helpers along the side. Doug Goudreau sends an email that day. I'm not joking. The same day I was sort of thinking, what am I going to do about this? I found the plans. So here we have them. There's the plans. That's my father's company from those days, the Canadian British Engineering Consultants there. That's the cover of it. This is the map. Now you can't see the details, but you can see there's Sydenham Street. There's going to be 3 facilities. There's the pumping station by the river, which you see at the top there, can barely see it probably. There's the water treatment plant, and then, which is the main thing. And then there's a filter house, which is a little rectangular building also beside Sydenham Street that already existed. They were just going to expand it. So there's the plan of that. And this is, finally, for the first time I saw what was this pump station going to look like. So you can see this. It's a tall building. You see the top 2 top left, and then the center there. The top left is the side view of it. So it was about 10 feet wide and 20 feet deep, and then about 30 feet or more high. And that's what this building was going to be. That's what they were building. And, excuse me, this is the excavation. This is just one of the many photos that my father took of that. And this is the furthest they got to build it. There are 5 of the men, and there they are pouring the foundation. That's as far as this got. After this cave-in, the project, they moved the pumping station to the other side of Sydenham Street and used a different technology for building it. So that's that part. But also, I'll just show you, there's the water treatment plant. That building still stands. If you look at it from the street, which we did originally, covered with trees, you don't realize it's actually a huge building. There's a photo that my father took. That is a color photo, by the way. My father took in 1957 of building the water treatment plant. Oops, I need that. And there's the plant after it was finished. And that's us. That's us filming it yesterday, actually, on the back of the building. It's a really large building if you go around and look at the back of it. So that's just one example of what's happened. And this has been happening over and over again. And it's very easy when you have information, once you have it, you just can take it for granted. But if I were to take those little bits of magic away, I would go all the way back to the moment where all I had was a diary and I didn't know any of this stuff. I didn't know any of these things. But it's like magic how the story slowly comes together. So I want to talk a little bit also about the making of the film itself. So we recently completed a crowdfunding campaign, which was quite an experience, I have to say. Very, very involved. It took pretty much all of our time for several months to do this, but the results are pretty incredible. We raised $78,000. 128 people contributed, which is really something almost miraculous, that level of support. So that's something, by the way, a very big shout out to all the people who supported that. Because of that, we are filming this summer. And because of that money, we can finish the filming part of the process. We will finish in early September, and we'll have, you could say, the film will be in the can. And that also allowed us to hire, finally, a cinematographer, excuse me. That is Pavel. Pavel is right over there on that camera. And Pavel is Polish. And when I first got an application from him, I thought, oh no, we cannot afford, sorry, I don't think this is going to work out. But we got talking, and it was clear that Pavel was willing to work for a lot less than he would normally earn, and that he was willing to come to Canada and join this project because he believed in the story. Also, there's Joseph Crawford, who is don't distract him, by the way. He is carefully minding all the complexities of doing a live stream and a live presentation at the same time. And Joseph is both a great filmmaker and even more so a really incredible editor, a brilliant editor. He is technically, honestly, a genius, working out all of the logistics of, for example, this. And I think he's a saint, because he's really given, until recently, not receiving a cent for this work. He has worked with me for the past year, and it's been pretty stressful. Also, because he believes in the story. So that's our little team. And this little team, we are doing the filming. We've got some other helpers, but those are the key people right there. I want to talk a little bit about the process. So our projected budget, because you might be wondering, oh my God, what does it cost to make a film? Well, our budget is $518,000. But the good news is we're actually very far along. We're almost halfway of that budget. And I want to show you how that breaks down. This is the columns of the ways of the money, basically. The first column represents what you'll see in every single filmmaker, unless they're really successful, is what they did themselves. So that's our own time and money, about $120,000 and counting. The second column shows you the crowdfunding. That's what 128 people collected so that we could finish the film this summer. That gets us to $200,000, almost halfway there. Now this is significant because at this point, I can guarantee you the film will be made. The question is, how long will it take us? So the next column there represents the next piece of what may or may not happen, which is finding an additional bit of private funding. Private funding will allow us to keep working on post-production, which is organizing and starting to assemble the story as a film, but most importantly also buys time for us to do the next round of selling this to broadcasters, to production companies, and that's where we'll get the next big chunk of money. When this will happen, I do not know, but if we are able to raise that next bridging money, we'll be able to focus on that into the new year, into the next year, and get this chunk of money. Now, I am a bit of a dreamer and an optimist, but it would be possible to finish this film next spring. With funding, this film could be finished next spring, and if we don't aim for it, it won't happen. So that's why we have this sort of really ambitious goal, and if it takes longer, it takes longer. But honestly, it is my dream that the people who are in this story will see this story on the screen. So that's why we are really pushing to finish it on time. So that kind of, that, by the way, also those columns represent the process of making a film very accurately. The blue column is what you could call pre-production. That's your research, looking for locations and so forth. What Joe and I did is kind of start filming. So while we were researching, we're already filming interviews. In fact, we've got some very incredible interviews from last year, possibly the most important interviews in the film. The second one, the green column, is the formally production. It's not only people talking on a camera, but we live in one of the most beautiful places in the world, southwestern Ontario, and we want to show that. And by the way, that's why Pavel's so important. Not only is he an incredible artist and a cinematographer with the ability to show how beautiful the land is, he's also looking at it with new eyes. He's Polish. This is new for him. And I want this film to be something that people all around the world could watch. So I want somebody to look at this place with those fresh eyes, somebody who's new to southwestern Ontario. Then the next column represents, let's say, whether or not we achieve private funding for the next $60,000. That represents the legwork of pitching your movie to broadcasters, perhaps CBC, TVO. I definitely want to get a Dutch broadcaster. This is always part of the process of making a film. That's how you raise money. The broadcaster licenses it, and you get the money for that, and then you continue. And then the last part is with the money that will come from other things like telefilm or something like that, or production companies. So you see here kind of the story of how all films are made, some version of that. So, yeah, I think I'll move on. But yeah, I just want to say once again, the reason we're even here, and I'm showing you the slide and talking about it, is because of the 128 people who supported us for this production. Otherwise, we would still be scrapping away and hoping to one day finish the film kind of thing. Okay, so I want to sort of go back to the story now, because actually this story doesn't actually start here. It starts in Holland. And it's all of the families, and that includes the people in the front of this room, all came from Holland to Canada. In fact, all of these families came between 1950 and 1953. And we will now do our best to make the connection work, because I'd like to welcome, and I hope she'll appear in a second, Anne van Aragon. She's a journalist, a historian, and she's the author of one of my favorite books on this topic, Uprooted. Welcome, Anne.
Good evening, Eric, and everybody else.
Thank you so much for joining. So, Anne, can you tell us what was happening in the Netherlands in the post-war years? Why were people emigrating from Holland?
There were actually several reasons, and one of them is the fact that Holland's population doubled in 50 years. There were just too many people in a very small country.
And everything else was totally aggravated by World War II. We had the Germans occupying us for 5 years, and they really stripped the country of every resource that wasn't tied down or welded down. There was hardly any economy left when the war ended. And then you take people like my father. He had 9 kids, 4 of them his son. He was looking for more land, more space.
Then, why were people coming from Holland to Canada?
Well, that kind of goes back to the war again, because
the Canadian soldiers liberated us, so there was an enormous amount of goodwill towards Canadian people in general. And not all the immigrants went to Canada. Some went to Brazil, South Africa, different places. But we were part of the contingent that came to Canada. And the fact is that Holland had this surplus of workers that the government needed to get rid of. And across the ocean, Canada had a really severe worker shortage on farms. I think in Nova Scotia, the average farmer was 65 years old. The farm sons had gone off to the war, and they came back, they wanted a paycheck. They weren't going to just put her around on the farm without a steady paycheck. So the two governments got together to address this issue. As a result, the only men that were allowed to immigrate to Canada had to sign a 1-year labor contract with a Canadian farmer. So Canada just seemed to offer a better future.
So tell me, what were the challenges that Dutch immigrants working as farmers and immigrants to Canada, what were the challenges that they faced here?
But the first one, of course, was language. When we came here, we didn't have yes or no, literally no English whatsoever. But there were also unrealistic expectations. Canada was kind of built up by the immigration authorities as like the holy city, like a New Jerusalem. There was so much opportunity here. It sounded like coming here and buying your own farm within a year might have worked. And it might, in fact, have worked if you had several sons old enough to go to work and earn money right away. The jobs were here, and the girls also found work easily. But people like my father, 9 kids, 11 and under, they had to struggle for years before they achieved any more than the bare survival.
So your book, Uprooted, looks at the impact that this had on children. What did your research and your own experience tell you about that?
I know of girls as young as 12 or 13 who didn't even get to see their new home before they were met at the train from Halifax and taken to jobs in Canadian households. They were immersed instantly into a whole new language and culture. And for my own experience, there was no help for school kids. We had to set out alone, nobody with us. We were told only to turn left out of the driveway, go to the crossroads, turn right until we found the school. Now in Holland, there were little short distances to walk to town and so on. We had to walk 4 kilometers in totally strange country. That was a lot for little kids. And at that, we were lucky. We had Miss Flossie White, and she taught us with a lot of care. She established what our learning levels were by having us do arithmetic problems. Math is sort of a universal language, and that's how she knew what grade we were in. But some of those Dutch kids met up with xenophobic teachers or teachers who sent them all back to grade 1. It was simpler. At home, of course, we were expected to do as we were told, to work hard, go to church twice on Sundays, and never ever look at boys who weren't Dutch and Reformed. But at the same time, we learned the language quickly, and that meant that we ended up being interpreters for our parents. We had to take responsibility, even in the home, when we should have been playing baseball. At home, we were minor children, and in school or at work, we had to integrate. We almost had to develop a split personality, and I've heard this from different people.
And what about employment for adults? So we've heard about starting out on farms, but was it typical of these 6 men, for example, to be doing largely manual work in construction?
Absolutely. In the 1950s, Dutch workers were seen as cheap labor. Even today, newcomers often have trouble getting recognition for any skills they have. And a lot of the work was hard and physical. You mentioned tobacco production. There was that, and there was sugar beets. Working 9-hour days in tanneries was no picnic. That's what my father did for 7 years. They were really brutal jobs in a lot of cases, and they paid poorly. My father made $75 a month in 1950. So what happened is he left within 11 months and found a job that paid $40 a week in a tannery. And the men in general all looked for other work very quickly as soon as the contract was up. And they moved into construction and other trades. And this is when workplace safety really wasn't on the radar yet. Immigrants just didn't have any recourse if there was a problem.
Well, thank you very much, Anne. Thank you for joining us.
You're welcome.
So for the men in this story, they found employment with Keeler Construction, and that was a step up. That was better pay and good work, and there was a lot of construction to do, so it's certainly a job that they wanted to have. Also, at that time, they were glad to have work because, in fact, that summer, There'd been hail damage to the tobacco crops, and in fact, there was a lot of unemployment happening at that point. So that's somewhere they were very happy to have work at all. One of those men, who's not in this picture, I apologize for the slide. This is showing working for Keeler. This is, in fact, a view of the pit from the side. One of those men, Anahovius, wrote a letter home to his family in Holland every Sunday. And in this letter, he mentions Dresden. There's 120 kilometers away, so they have to stay there during the week. He says, but they're glad to have jobs. He mentions the tobacco harvest damage and unemployment. And he also mentions that the boss has work, local work, but we started in Dresden, so we might as well continue, or words to that effect. And what makes that comment so chilling is that he knew, and the other men knew, that this job was dangerous. In fact, 5 of the 6 men talked to their families or their wives about that danger. So they were well aware of it. Here's a photo of one of the things that would have shown them it was dangerous, and everybody involved with this project would have known it was dangerous. That's one of the small cave-ins, plenty big enough to kill a man, or more than one man actually, but that's one of the smaller cave-ins, and they had several of them in the week leading up to the big cave-in. Here's a photo of the same site after the cave-in, just showing you a little bit of the dimension and the size and the height that we're talking about on Sydenham Street. And there another photo from Sydenham Street looking down. This may be after the bodies had been recovered. You can see a policeman guarding the site in the far back of the photo there. Also, in the immediate aftermath of the accident, several newspapers reported that the men had talked about the danger or complained about the danger. So there was really an awareness that this was very, very risky. So I'd like to, I'll skip forward 1 second. One other slide. This is the only slide that I have, or picture that I've found so far of the inquest. This is the inquest. That wallpaper had to be maybe this back wall here. That's here in this building on September the 12th, 1957, 4 weeks after the cave-in. On the left, you can see Blake Edwards, who's the Crown Attorney from Chatham. And on the right, you can see Dr. E.R. Tiffin, who is the coroner. He's presiding over the coroner's inquest. So that's the only photo I ever saw of the actual inquest itself. We may find more. We're still looking. But I'd like to spend a moment and look at the issue of job safety and the psychology of the worker in dealing with job safety. So I want to introduce Mike Chappell, who is a retired professor of occupational health and safety at Toronto Metropolitan University. He is also used to be the provincial coordinator with the Ontario Ministry of Labour, and he is an expert in workplace safety and also the history of workplace safety. So we will have Mike join us.
Okay, guys, thanks for asking me.
Hey, Mike. Thank you for joining us. Just to start off, before we had met, Mike, had you heard of the Dresden tragedy?
I never had. I never received that training from the Ministry of Labour when I worked there, and we actually never encountered it in Toronto Metropolitan University in all the years that I've taught there. It's surprising in many ways, but it's true.
Can you tell me, how is it possible that even an expert in workplace safety wouldn't know about something like that?
I think there's a couple of things going on in Dresden. Firstly, it's a small community. It's quite far away from the GTA, which, as we know, even today is the center of the province, and the workers are non-unionized. And so there's very little voice, there's very little outcry, except from the families themselves. And in 1957, there was no established Occupational Health and Safety Act or enforcement process. So those voices simply weren't heard.
So as we've spoken, you've obviously learned about this event. What stands out for you about the Dresden tragedy?
Well, these workers, and you said it yourself, they knew it was dangerous, but they continued to work anyway. And it's very common even today. Workers that come that immigrate in their first or second or third jobs, they don't speak English well. They depend on that job for their family. So even if it's unsafe, they'll continue to work. And today we have people come, they don't have a work permit, so they work for cash. It's part of the underground economy. They get paid less than a regular worker, so the employer saves money, but they take horrible chances with their safety. And employers don't care, unfortunately.
So tell me, you've said that some of that's still the same, but what has changed since 1957?
Well, since 1957, actually since 1980, we've had the Occupational Health and Safety Act. The province have hired a number of occupational health and safety inspectors, both in construction, industrial, and the mining sector. They do regular proactive workplace inspections on all types of workplaces, not just unionized workplaces, but anywhere construction work is going on. An inspector can and will show up and will intercede if the work is unsafe. They have the power to stop work. They have the power to order changes be made so that the work is safe.
So yeah, now another aspect of this is my father in his diary describes the soil quite specifically. There was sandy soil at the top, there was blue clay at the bottom, but in the middle, and most of it was varved clay. What is that?
Varved clay is an unusual type of soil, and I shouldn't say unusual. It's unusual in the sense that it's very dangerous. It was formed at the end of the last ice age. When the glaciers started to melt, each year water rushed down from their surfaces into glacier lakes, and it formed a sort of milky surface in the water. Over time, that sediment started to settle out. The heaviest particles were silt, so they settled here at the bottom. Then a little lighter particle on top was the clay, so they settled on top of them. So you have these two layers, one silt and one heavier clay or lighter clay on top of it. The clay will not carry water. It's impervious to water. The silt is full of water. So if you can imagine layer after layer after layer, probably for hundreds of years, these varves build up. And it's like a spaghetti of water with heavier particles in between. And over time they crack. So water moves from one layer to another. And they're susceptible, either when it rains or when there's vibrations, to suddenly slide. When there's nothing supporting them on the side, as you talked about, a 35-foot high wall, nothing supporting that can suddenly slide laterally and collapse, which is what happened.
Please state this because I know the audio is a little tough to hear. So, Mike, if I'm saying this correctly, between the thick, non-porous layers of clay, we have this silt, and that is mobile because it's wet, and that's why this type of material is particularly unstable. Is that correct?
That is correct. And under certain circumstances, certain vibrations, it can liquefy, and it can actually collapse within a moment's notice.
Right. Now, my father, who was not an expert in soil mechanics, he did request several times that the contractor hire someone to do soil testing. Now, in the 1950s, what would soil testing have told them? Did they know about varved clay? What would soil testing have done if they had done it at that time?
At that time, geotechnical analysis was in its infancy compared to now, but they still knew about varved clay. And there would be two ways to do a soils analysis. One would be simply dig a pit with a backhoe and take a look at what you saw on the side of the trench. The second, which was more common, was to drill a hole called a borehole, pull a sample out and look at it layer by layer. And that's actually better, of course, because when you see the core come out, you can see the layers so distinctly, and if they're unstable as they're pulled out of the hole. No doubt about it, the expertise existed in 1957 to determine that this was hazardous.
So it's incredible then. They would have known it was varved clay, which would have told them this is exceptionally unstable. I guess we didn't prepare this question, but just to finish this thought, I still don't understand how you could have an inquest and not have anyone who knows anything about soil testify at the inquest. Is that shocking for you to hear?
It's shocking by today's standards, Eric, and it certainly wouldn't happen today. But back in 1957, inquests were far more of an ad hoc process. They depended on the local coroner, the local crown attorney, and if they had no experience in dealing with soil collapses, and they probably didn't, this would be a first experience for them. How would they know who to call? There was no union on the other side saying, wait a second, let's get an engineer in here. And that's really the big difference between this and Hogs Hollow, which, as you saw, was a massive inquest. And I think that the unions drove that. And people have their opinions about unions, but one thing is for sure, they look after the workers' safety.
Right. Okay, thank you very much for joining us, Mike. Thank you. The worker vulnerability question was expressed also a little bit by Anne Van Aragon, where they just need the job and they're going to do it because they've got to support their family. And then, as Mike was saying afterwards, immigrant workers in particular are not likely to complain. They need the job. They don't want to make trouble. And therefore, they are just that much more likely to get themselves or to stay in a dangerous situation. And sadly, that is what happened here. These workers did that. But also, sadly, as you will note from the news, when we do hear about accidents still today, they are overwhelmingly, or I shouldn't say overwhelmingly, but disproportionately often, it is immigrants who are dying. The most recent major multi-fatality workplace tragedy in Ontario was in 2009 when a swing stage collapsed. 4 workers died. Also immigrants again. Recently in the United States, there was a bridge that collapsed because a ship ran into it in Baltimore. 6 workers died, and it's just strange how it's over and over again immigrant workers. So this is a very real thing, and it's still a real thing today. The other thing that Mike said is that the expertise existed at that time. People did know about Varve clay, but they never got an expert on site who would have told them right away, this is dangerous, get everybody out of the pit now. So unfortunately, those things didn't happen. Now, I'd like to get us ready sort of for what I think is the most important moment of this evening. This is the day, this is even the weekday, it was on a Wednesday in 1957. This is the time, the last moments or minutes when these men were still alive, because about 7 o'clock is when this collapse happened. And it was a total collapse. They were, one of them, one other Dutch guy, a 19-year-old Harry Okema, he lived in Dresden. His mother called him home for dinner. So he's the one of the people who survived. Otherwise, he would have been in the pit as well. They were working at the bottom of the pit. At the 2 corners of the pit, the contractor, Alvin Keeler, has come down. He'd been in meetings with the plumber all afternoon. He comes down. He's standing at the corner of the pit. Standing on the opposite corner, kitty corner to him, is the foreman, Dirk Reichson. And they're watching the last load of concrete be poured. This part of the job is going to be finished in 10 minutes, 15 minutes. It's nearly done. The day is nearly done. Now, at some moment, and we only know this from the newspaper because Alvin Keeler did not say this in the inquest, but in the newspaper we know Alvin Keeler saw a crack appear about 8 feet from the bottom of the pit, suddenly race across the bottom of the pit, and they yelled to the guys, and the guys may have seen it, but then the whole front of the pit fell forward, and that was it. When this happened, the formwork of the foundation that they were pouring, it collapsed. So Alvin Keeler was trapped by that. His leg got pinned inside the formwork, and he was trapped, and he was actually partly covered by soil, which, from what I've heard from people, is a terrifying experience. Dirk Reichson, the foreman, also, because of the formwork collapsing, he fell into the pit, and he died. So he is the 6th man that died. This is what happened almost about now. So what I'd like to do now is turn our thoughts to that and have just recognize each of these men. Sorry, I've got the wrong slide up there. Recognize each of them And I would like to ask that when I say the name of each of these men, their family members, if they're able, will stand up. And then after all of the family members are standing up, that all the rest of us also stand up if we're able, and that we have a moment of silence together. Okay? So I'm going to begin with the youngest person to die that day, and that was Wiebrand, or Wilfred Hovius. He was 19. He's the son, please, yes. Wiebrand was 19. He was the oldest son of Anna and Wiebrich Hovius, and as I said, 19 years old. His father, Anna Hovius, died beside him. Anna was 39 years old. He left his wife and 7 other children behind. Dirk, or known as Dick Rykson, would have turned 38, and I'm not sure if we got a VCs. Do we have VCs? Thank you. Yes. Dirk Rykson would have turned 38 in September that year. He left his wife and a young son, John, behind, who was almost 3 years old. Sorry, that's Dirk. Jan Bramer was 43. He had a wife and 4 children. Their eldest his adult son Herman attended the coroner's inquest here in Dresden after the accident. So Herman Bramer was here. Jan Oldewening was 45. He had a wife and also 4 children, and his eldest daughter Annie was 14 when he died. And finally, Hendrik Drent was the oldest in the group. He was 58. He had 5 children, but his eldest daughter had died of a brain aneurysm at 22, just a few years before. Hendrik's eldest son, Chris, attended the coroner's inquest here with Herman Bramer. So if we can we all stand up for a moment and join in a moment of silence? Thank you. I'm going to ask Andy Cornell. Andy is the pastor at the St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church right across the way. And I'd like to ask Andy to come up and say a few words.
Thank you, Eric. It is an honor to be here today. I'm going to read Psalm 23 in the King James Version, a version that would have been well known to the men. The psalmist writes, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures, and he leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For thou art with me, thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table for me in the presence of my enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy will follow all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." The men who died were all members of the Christian Reformed Church, whose manse was just across the road from the site, just a few doors down. The house still stands today. Members of that congregation, the Dresden CRC, provided almost a home away from home. They provided hospitality and community for these people. All 6 men would have known this psalm. They would have known it by memory. And they knew that upon death, they would dwell in his house. Their struggles ended and their new lives awaited. And we are invited today to find some peace and some level of comfort in that. Psalm 23 is also a powerful reminder that we are not alone spiritually. Yes, we live in a broken world, clearly. Pain and suffering and division, tragedies will occur again and again, no matter how many safeguards we put in place. And so in the face of mortality, we are invited to live with the peace of mind that comes from knowing that the Lord is our shepherd and provides all that we need, physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. And we are invited to dwell in that place. Psalm 23 is commonly read at funerals, times when we honor and remember those whose lives have been lived. I like to remind people that funerals are not for the dead, they're for the living. Gatherings such as this are for those left behind whose time has not yet come. And so when we remember, the purpose is not to lament, but to be reminded that we have work to do. Not just to make this world a better place, but to live in hope. We don't know the time or the place of our departure. As we are reminded this evening, it may come suddenly and tragically and violently. I wonder if the bravery of those men who died on August 14th, 1957, who returned to the work site day after day, despite the dangers, I wonder if that bravery was due to the fact that they knew they had a shepherd who prepared a place for them. And that same shepherd is with us today. Let's pause and just gather our hearts and minds together in a few words of prayer. Heavenly Father, Creator God, we come to you as broken people in need of your strength, your wisdom, and your peace. We are reminded that you have not given us a spirit of fear and timidity, but of power, love, and self-discipline. Father, as we go from this place, may we know your will for us, your perfect will, as it is in heaven. Father, I boldly ask that you grant the prayers and the requests of these crusading filmmakers. Provide everything they need to get the job done. And may all of this work together for good in a world that needs a little more illumination right now. We lift this up in Jesus' name. And all God's people say, amen.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And I do want to apologize to the Drents and actually all of you. The talking and the tech and the emotion, I forgot to move the slide. So let's just take a look. There's Jan Oldewening. And there's Hendrik Drent, surrounded by his family, including the eldest daughter, Geertje, who died a few years later. I love that photo. That's one of the best photos of a family that's just arrived in Canada, and you can see some real spirit in that group. So that is our event for today. I want to thank you all for coming. I think it's really important that we're doing this together, this moment of acknowledgement. I also want to say a very big thank you to Al Kamenek, who runs the Czech Hall where we are right now. Al didn't hesitate for 1 second when I asked if we could do this here, because this was the place where the inquest was. This is part of that story. He never asked for any money. Thank you so much, everybody. That's the end of our event.
I think he tried to suppress the whole thing.
She never really got over that accident.
I could have been part of that team. Who knows what would have happened to me.
People just wanted to get on with life and didn't want to hear bad things in the 50s. And the fact that it conveniently happened to an immigrant group that didn't speak particularly good English made it easy to do so.
I couldn't believe that something that terrible had happened here and that I hadn't known about it.